This is Anu Ramaswamy. I'm the faculty director of the Center for Global India at the Princeton Institute of International and Regional Studies at Princeton University. I'm jointly appointed across civil and environmental engineering, the High Meadows Environmental Institute, and I'm professor of India Studies at Pierce at Princeton. And it is my great pleasure to be inviting and introducing Professor Narendar Pani, who is going to give us a very exciting seminar on really understanding inequality as an instrument. So his title is The Instrumentality of Rural Inequality. And as background, I wanted to say that we are proposing to have a new course at Princeton next semester that I'll be convening on inequality in India and the US. So we're getting a preview through these talks of some of the biggest challenges relating to inequality in India. So I want to take this opportunity to welcome the audience. We're meeting on Zoom, and I can see that we have people from different disciplines and from different countries. So welcome to this seminar. And I want to say a brief word about the Chadha Center for Global India. The Chadha Center was launched in 2018, and I joined as faculty director in 2019, just right before the pandemic. And the goal of the center is to advance research, teaching, and engagement with scholars in India as well as worldwide on how interactions between India and the world can shape human and planetary well-being. And so our theme today is on inequality. And as I mentioned, I'm super delighted and we're really happy to invite Dr. Pani to offer his remarks on the instrumentality of rural inequality. Narendar Pani is a professor at the National Institute of Advanced Studies in Bangalore, India, where he is also the dean of the School for Social Sciences, and he heads the Inequality and Human Development Program. He has his PhD in economics, after which he moved into transdisciplinary research, which allows him to explore diverse interconnected aspects of India. His work over the last 4 decades has ranged from agrarian reform to urban processes, confronting challenges of method along the way. His books include Inclusive Economics, Gandhian Method and Contemporary Policy in 2002, and The Cities as Action, Retheorizing Urban Studies, forthcoming in 2022. And of course, he has a book on rural inequality and transformations that he's going to talk about. So welcome, and I hand over to you. So the charge is going to be that we'll invite Professor Pani to speak. I invite the audience to put your questions in the chat, and we should have at least 20 minutes towards the end to engage in discussion, and I'll moderate the discussion session. So with that, welcome.
Thank you, Professor Ramaswamy. Thank you for having me here. I will just try to address an issue that has been sort of implicit in much of our understanding of India, that the country is somehow immune to the problem of inequality. The inequality in India is quite stark for even casual observers, and any kind of data analysis brings it out even more sharply. We have the individuals who are a part of the top of 10 richest people in the world, and we are also have a prominent place towards the bottom of most global indices of starvation. You have in the academic discourse evidence of increasing inequalities accompanied by a declining influence of left politics or any inequality or any politics built around the idea of inequality. I'm trying to argue today, as briefly as I can, that essentially this is a bit of a misreading of a complex process. And what has happened really is not that inequality has become less important, but that it is expressing itself not through the traditional norms of class and caste, but more through more personalized and individualized norms, which lead in many ways to identity politics. So I would like to, if I may just share my screen. I would request I think the host to disable participant screen sharing, but it would help if I could do that. Rushita?
I'm sorry, 1 second. You should be able to do it now, Dr. Pani.
Right. So what I'll be trying to do is really trying to make my case through a brief discussion of three broad paths, if you like. One is a somewhat conceptual path on inequality or conceptualizing inequality. I would then go on to conceptualize diverse rural transformations and the role inequality plays in them, before finally focusing on the personalizing of inequality, what it does to relationship between identity and victimhood, and more importantly, for those who are watching India closely or rural India closely, the issue of what role it plays in precariousness and farmer suicides. When we look at inequality, most discourses on inequality tend to treat it in a rather algebraic or mathematical sense, in the sense that you treat it primarily as difference. And this means that most economists or economic understanding of inequality is identical with difference. The measurements of inequality, like the Gini coefficient, are almost entirely matters of difference. But there are obviously differences that are desirable. I mean, I think it's a great honor to be invited to speak at Princeton. And that's clearly because Princeton is different from many other universities. And that's not a difference that one would call an inequality, though it's clearly a very stark one. So I think we need to distinguish between inequality, between differences that can be both positive and negative, and inequality which has a somewhat negative connotation. So in our work, we have taken inequality as ethically undesirable differences. In using this concept, we open up, in a sense, a Pandora's box, because what is ethically desirable or undesirable is subject to a variety of very diverse views. So what we tend to do to try and reduce that diversity or reduce that conceptualization difference is to borrow from moral theory, really, or the ethics of morality, where we talk primarily, where a distinction is often made between normative morality and descriptive morality. So we look at normative inequality as differences that are considered undesirable by all rational persons. So normative inequality is a debate that takes place entirely in the realm of rationality. It would range from the positions taken by Dworkin or by Sen or any of the other rationally defined schools. At the same time, when we look at inequality in India, there's a very major emphasis in practice on beliefs that are really not subject to rational thinking. It could be about women. It could be about honor killings of women. It could take very dramatic and drastic forms, which are very difficult to justify rationally, but are nevertheless deeply entrenched in Indian beliefs. So we take that as descriptive inequalities, differences that a society or a group considers ethically unacceptable. Now, these differences, the normative and the descriptive, are in a process of continuous interaction. And that interaction can be seen primarily in three domains. The first is that of intergroup inequality, where we are looking at the ethical norms in the relationship between groups. What should the groups be defined as, or what aspects of the groups that we are looking at? This is largely an ideological discourse, which takes us from either class analysis to caste analysis or to other groups that emerge. We also have interpersonal inequality within these groups, where we built around social norms of interpersonal relations. This can extend to behavioral discourse, but it has a prominent place for discrimination. It could be discrimination based upon group characteristics. It could be discrimination just on an individual basis. But they basically see the person as reflective of rather larger differences that are not acceptable. And these we also bring into this picture the idea of intrapersonal inequality, which is one that I would argue has been grossly neglected and understated. And that is really that when you have the experience of a same person changes over time, you might believe at a later period that you have been unjustly treated, or whether it's life that's treating you unjustly, or whether it's other individuals that are treating you unjustly. You might feel you're a victim of circumstances or a victim of other groups. And this, I'd like to emphasize, can be, as we shall see in a while, and a very important part of understanding the role inequality plays in India. And the ethical discussion here is around how we ought to live our lives, how are we, and whether we are allowed to do so. And the discourse generally tends to move around the person and identity. All right. Now, these inequalities play themselves out in the transformation in rural India. Now, this transformation has traditionally been seen through a variety of very different kind of perspectives and conditions. But essentially, sometimes it's been looked at by Marxists as the changes in the mode of production. Others have seen it as changes in market conditions. And you can come up with a number of very different structures, but all of them tend to focus on just the center, or defining a kind of what statisticians will call a measure of central tendency. But what you actually find is actually a very diverse set of consequences of one common prompt, if you like. And that's really that there is pressure on agriculture, and there are millions of cultivators being forced to move out of agriculture, even as other cultivators are being degraded or sort of pushed down into the ranks of agricultural labor. In this process, we then end up with inequalities of different kinds that sort of emerge from that process and are further developed in that process. One is intergenerational inequalities, because inheritance laws in India ensure that the property is divided equally among all the children. Of course, gender bias could ensure that the women don't always get a share, but even then it's divided among all the male members of the family. So with each generation, you move into smaller and smaller holdings. And that leads to the fragmentation of holdings, and therefore each family in a succeeding generation that is based entirely on agriculture would be worse off than the previous generation. I'm talking, of course, only of landholding families. Now, when the farms become very small, the cultivators at one level, cultivators get pushed into agricultural labor. The farms are no longer viable. So that leads to class inequalities coming to the center of the discourse. At another level, you find the dominance hierarchies between different classes or different groups of farmers, often built around identities of caste or sometimes religion or any other element. So this changing dominance identities leads to inequalities between identities that sometimes has been analyzed as horizontal inequalities. But in this entire process, individuals find themselves in rapidly changing situations, and situations that they very often think have been unfair to them. And therefore, they believe they have suffered an intrapersonal inequality. When we look at this process, we need to decide how we are going to analyze it. And if we decide that sticking to the means of measures of central tendency is not necessarily the best way to go, an alternative is to look at the range within which the different situations emerge. So we've sort of conceptualized that by looking at what would happen to an individual farmer who finds himself, more often than herself, in an extremely vulnerable position. And that farmers, whereas the pressures on agriculture, if we start with that, generate a certain pressure to move out of agriculture. They tend to look for jobs that can be accessed while they continue to reside in the village. That's the least change option for them. When that does not happen, they look for jobs further away, which would lead them to wait for urban jobs. When those jobs, once again, do not allow for a permanent migration to the cities, So the more vulnerable among them are then left doing short-term assignments, and even then they don't get employment for more than 6 months in a year, leaving them as doing primarily marginal work, or what the Census of India calls marginal work. And very often that marginal, if that also is not available, they just do what they can get in agriculture. So they're in a cycle of vulnerability. But at each stage in the cycle, there is an escape that is possible. Even within agriculture, there are in very small pockets, there are large technology, modern technology farms, which are emerging. So those who can get employment there get an option. So there is a possibility of a movement from declining and stagnant agriculture into a more modern one. There are those who, if you can look at those whose jobs can be accessed from the village, right? They then look for non-farm jobs while continuing to reside in the village, while those others can who get jobs at more distant places can look at permanent migration, and those who have marginal work are looking at short-term migration to each center, which means that at each stage in the cycle of vulnerability, there is a possibility of escape. And the movement from the vulnerability to escape, right, is in a sense a transformation. It's a personalized transformation, it's a transformation of certain classes of people. So you can identify 4 separate transformations. One which involves, say, a local non-farm transformation, that is like the vulnerable former farmer gets work near the village. The other is a permanent transformation where they leave the rural areas altogether. Then you have the transformation of short-term work, where they just go to the urban centers for short assignments. And then you have a transformation within agriculture itself, where you can have more people entering areas which have large farms. Now, each of these 4 transformations has its own dynamics. The local non-farm transformation looks for opportunities in the vicinity of the village, and it typically leads to, it's a form of transformation from above. The older generation remains in agriculture, the younger generation gets educated and looks for non-farm jobs. The leaving rural transformation provides non-farm opportunities at a distance from the village. This involves permanent migration out of the village. It's usually led by individual males, followed by the rest of the family. And sometimes, of course, it can lead to an incomplete process where the male migrates and the rest of the family keeps waiting and is not able to sort of get the resources or any other overcome other constraints in migrating to the urban center. The marginal worker transformation is the one where workers are employed for less than 6 months in a year. The marginal workers with short-term assignments in urban centers. So they have, it is short-term male migration, usually as a group, and a group of young males, and therefore very little place for women in them, in that group. And over time, that leads to a situation where the household continues in the village, but a part of the group of the labor is a part of the group in the cities and earns. So the earnings in the cities where the household is in the village. And finally, there's the entering agriculture transformation, which comes in 2 versions. One is the modern agriculture version, where workers move into large modern farms. And the other is what you can call a tattered safety net version. That is, the vulnerable try out all their options, and then they just return to a village, a roof over their head in the village without land, with or without land as a safety net. So we tried to look at these patterns across India and at a district level. And this is broadly what we found, that these patterns tend to have a certain element of contiguity within them. The local non-farm transformation, that is, you stay in the village and work around, is concentrated in the southern state of Tamil Nadu. And it is consistent with that state's success in a dispersed strategy of industrialization. Right, so you get such a widely dispersed industrial network so that industrial or non-farm opportunities are available across in the vicinity of a large number of villages. The leading rural transformation is in a sense more broad-based, but it tends to be concentrated in the southwestern state of Kerala, as well as in the coastal districts of coastal Andhra Pradesh, and also in Bengal, so on the east coast. Right? The marginal worker transformation is in some senses the most widespread. It is concentrated primarily in the north and the east, with the east having a greater share of the pressure. And these workers have to find opportunities at other parts of the country. Sometimes they travel thousands of kilometers. And as the COVID crisis showed us, their numbers are very, very large. There are tens of millions, maybe over 100 million as well in some estimates. So we're really looking at, and when the COVID crisis happened and you did not have the ability to move them back to where they were, to their homes in the villages, you ended up with a very severe crisis. So essentially then you have the fourth transformation, which is really in the central parts of Maharashtra, as well as in a couple of northern districts in Karnataka, but they seem to be two different transformations. In Maharashtra, central Maharashtra, in the region, for those of you who are politically inclined, of Sharad Pawar, what you find there is essentially a process where they go into large farms and find work as agricultural labor. Whereas in northern Karnataka, they seem to be much more in the form of going back in distress to whatever agricultural work they can find. So what we have got is a very dispersed pattern across the country, which makes it clear that going back to any kind of national average is not going to be of much use, and that we need to understand the diversity of what it does. And this diversity is in many ways better understood through snapshots of inequality, where essentially each one provides a situational dimension of inequality with its particular characteristics in that region. Right? You also, so if you're looking at that, trying to understand it, the very diverse patterns that emerge imply that you look at inequality and experience it very differently in different parts of the country. And that difference has affected the way Indians look at inequality. They tend to focus on the local rather than very distant pictures, or let alone national pictures of inequality. And this has also led to a focus on individual opinion over larger ideological discourse, particularly over the last 30 years after the Indian economy liberalized and allowed regional diversity to grow, or regional inequalities to grow. These inequalities come in two forms, and one is tangible, of course, elements that have or can be related to a tangible form. We have worked out indices. I will not go into it in detail here, though we could, if anybody wants more details, can provide it in the Q&A. We have worked out an index of the distance from absolute deprivation based. It's an asset-based index. And the other is an index of dominance, where we look at numerical dominance based on a wider conception of politics. We look at economic dominance, and we look at dominance in education. And then we try to understand patterns of local dominance by looking at the difference in dominance between the major identity groups. Together with this, we recognize the importance of intangible inequalities, that is, differences that are not discernible in physical terms. Right? And this can very often take the form of what we call rituals of discrimination. We borrowed here from Fritz Stahl's work on Vedic Indian systems, where he refers to ritual as a system of acts and sounds related to each other in a way with rules and without reference to meaning. This is a definition that, of course, it's been, he was talking primarily of Vedic rituals, but actually you can look at this in a wider sense of as a ritual of discrimination, and you find, I believe it can be as effective in understanding caste discrimination as in understanding race discrimination. So when we do this, what we find really is a set of very distinct patterns in each form of transformation. Right? In the index of dominance, what you find in the local non-farm transformation is a transformation from above. So the traditional dominance is not completely broken down. It continues even in the new form with the younger generation tapping more modern resources. The leaving rural, basically the elite has left the rural areas. So the extent of dominance has actually declined in that area. In the marginal worker category, the pressure on the economy is so intense that the traditional elites tend to lose much of their influence. And you also have migrant workers who return to the village beginning to assert themselves, particularly among the originally more backward castes. So the level of dominance or the index of identity dominance comes down further. But when you come to the entering agriculture picture, the transformation, there both forms of this transformation tend to increase the role of the dominant identity. But this could be in the modern system, the single large employer tends to be very much more dominant. And also in the system where they go back in distress, they have lost their dominance, so the relative dominance becomes even greater because they've lost whatever influence they may have had. Right? You also have the consequences of this process is that particularly the marginal workers, we saw on the map how widespread that distribution is. They bargain, the bargaining in India has moved substantially from workplace bargaining. Unions have lost much of their influence, but it has led to a rise in identity bargaining, particularly for workers coming in groups to the city and searching for work. So the nature of bargaining for wages and other benefits has also changed. There's also a shift in the emphasis in caste negotiations, because when they go back to the village, you might have the migrants who came out for short-term assignments in the city may have belonged to the lower end of the caste hierarchy in the village. But when they return, they begin to assert themselves, leading to conflict. But over time, you tend to see a difference. If you see caste hierarchies and conflicts of caste hierarchies as vertical inequalities, there's a movement towards identity-based conflicts, or what can be broadly referred to as horizontal inequalities. So you have the elements there also extending to within the household. We've looked at interpersonal inequality primarily in terms of what happens within the household, the gender differences within the household, and each form of transformation leaves its mark. In the local non-farm transformation, the modernization in a way leads to less discrimination. It's still quite large, but relatively less discrimination in the gap in the workforce. But education comes up with an interesting trap, because for women to be educated, it is an advantage in the sense in the arranged marriage system that prevails, they can get better qualified husbands. But if they get too educated, the availability of better qualified husbands would go down and therefore reduce the chances of getting married. So this is a kind of dilemma that works in this form of transformation. In the leaving rural transformation, the few opportunities that exist are tapped largely by the men, even in families, even if the women want to finally escape the poorly performing village, they need to hope that their husbands will do well in the city and take them into the city. So there is a preference for the male getting both education and in the workforce as well. In the marginal worker transformation, as we noted earlier, the conditions are very adverse to women. The group, they come out as young male groups of workers, and that with no place for women. So there's a very sharp difference or discrimination against women getting in the workplace or in the workforce. And that discrimination, because there's some basic levels of education required, extends into the gender gap in education as well. But it's in the entering agriculture transformation that the distinction is very, very sharp and quite visible. And that is that the need to work. This is one of the transformations where the pressure is greatest on the poor. So the need to work is so widespread that you cannot keep women from working. But at the same time, that doesn't change the attitudes about the future or about the role of education. So the gender gap in education remains very large. All right? So what happens in these transformations, you get a redefinition of the gender discrimination. There's also an effort to keep up with other castes. In the intrapersonal inequality or the sense of victimhood, you get a clear picture of education being developing a greater sense of victimhood than assets. In some sense, asset inequalities are treated as something that they're born into, and there's a certain, if not an acceptance of it, there is a certain, there's less sort of dissent around it. But education is something that is new, that has come in and has, in some senses, caused a great deal of disruption with castes that were previously not dominant, now some of them gaining roles, and some of the peasant castes, which dominated the rural environment in the past, but did not believe that education helped in agriculture and therefore did not emphasize this in the past, beginning to feel they have lost out. So there's a great deal of a sense of victimhood about in terms of education. And this is a sense of victimhood that extends to the more dominant groups. And it is this element that comes into the picture, because now even dominant groups can feel that they have a sense of victimhood in education. And so this becomes an instrument in identity negotiations. And the most powerful identities can also generate a discourse of victimhood. In fact, in India today, the largest identity group, the largest religious identity, which dominates the cultural domain, dominates the economic domain, dominates the political domain, has effectively built a discourse of victimhood, where they believe they are the most victimized, and it is a part of a regular political discourse, and in fact, it's a dominant political discourse. So what we see here, along with this, is a process where the victimhood is also brought into a kind of a personalized way, because it's a personalized experience. And this, in the Living Rural Transformation, if we look closely at the two states where there was a maximum increase in farmer suicides. One was Kerala and the other was Maharashtra. Kerala has got the maximum rate of farmer suicides, though being a small state, the total numbers are not the largest, but it's still a very high rate of the agrarian population. So what we see there is, in the Living Rural Transformation, you have large-scale migration out of the village, which is easy for young males. Sorry.
Dr. Pani, I was also going to request if your microphone could come a bit closer, because sometimes your voice goes low, if it's possible. Thank you.
Yeah. Is this better?
Yes.
Okay. So the migration out of the village, each group finds a different set of opportunities. Young males can use occupation to migrate, particularly when it is construction migration, when you're building a multi-storied structure, given the safety norms in India, it is not really available to the older male, that kind of activity or that kind of work. Young women do it primarily through marriage migration, right? And the older generation is therefore largely left behind. This process puts extreme pressure on agricultural labor, because there's falling employment in agriculture. At the same time, there's a patriarchal responsibility to help the daughter marry out of agriculture. So very often they adopt lifestyles which are well beyond their means. They take loans that they know they cannot repay, and that sooner or later results in agricultural labor suicide. So bulk of the suicides in Kerala are predominantly agricultural labor suicides, and the rate, as I said, is very high. It's important to note that this particular transformation generates much more suicides than the poorer transformations, like the marginal worker transformation. In fact, the rate of suicides in the marginal worker transformation is the lowest, which fits in, of course, those of you who are interested in the sociology of suicides, with Durkheim's original conception of the process. The other situation that emerged was in the entering agriculture transformation, where agriculture is changing and you're getting the growth of very large farms. So small farmers obviously get pushed out in that process, and they get pushed into becoming agricultural labor. but at least they have some employment. But the middle farmers who come under pressure to become large farmers or move out of agriculture. And they tend to use borrowing as their main form of transformation, or to either to invest in land, or they borrow to get opportunities outside agriculture, both formal opportunities and informal. You might borrow to pay a huge bribe to get a government job, whatever pattern you take. If there's any of these systems work or these investments don't work, if you end up with your investment in land going wrong, particularly when you invest in irrigation and the pump sets don't work, or if you give a bribe and still don't get a job, that leads to tremendous pressure on the individual and has been a major factor in middle farmer suicides. So there is this whole pressure that builds up and is reflected in farmer suicides. And this pressure also gets into a situation where it must be seen in the larger context of the transformation, because the pressure is in some sense transferable. If you have a family which has which faces a situation of extreme pressure within their agrarian efforts, the main when the head of the household borrows and cannot repay, that leads to a farmer's suicide. But very often they can a major part of that pressure can be put onto the daughter-in-law and a continuing demand for increased dowries, which then is reflected in housewife suicides. In fact, if you were to look at over a period of 20 years or so, you look at the pattern, the ratio of suicide mortality rates of farmers to housewives, right? It is typically less than 1, which means that there are more housewife suicides than farmer suicides. So that is a part, the whole suicide is a part of is a reflection of inequality, and it is much more of a social process than an individual one. So it is really an effect that can spread from one of inequality that can spread from one domain to another. And I would therefore just go back to where we started from and argue that Indian society is far from immune to inequality. It's just that its effects are beyond the discourse of class and caste, and much more in the discourse of intrapersonal inequality. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. That was just a very deep, very rich, and a very different take on inequality. As you said, we're so often looking at measures of difference and central tendencies that this is really, really important and exciting for us to see, and also sobering, to see that here is a cycle of transformation, and what the richness that you have laid out in the 4 processes is really, really very valuable for our audience. So we have several audience questions, and I'm going to invite more of the audience to put out your questions. I'm going to read them and invite Dr. Pani to respond. So the first question is talking about they're both from Damayanti Radeshwar, and the 2 questions, the first one is, are we looking at small farms collectively working together, in short, cooperative farms? And then the second is, are you including the physical conditions in rural India? And so the conditions in the villages are quite different from urban areas. And so if you can talk more about access to infrastructure, but then the issue of the challenges of moving to urban areas are not trivial either. So why don't we begin with those 2 questions, and then I'll read off the others.
Cooperative farms, in theory, would imply the bringing together small farms, and in some parts of India that did happen, but it has largely been under the sort of umbrella of larger farms. This is largely the pattern that you get in states like Maharashtra and to some parts of northwestern Karnataka. but they are really parts of dominant class farming. It is just that once the small farmers come into it, you become a part of a larger group. Your bargaining ability increases, particularly in a political sense. But the alliance typically does not represent small farmers alone. And so the traditional expectation of a small farmer cooperative is not always borne out. In fact, the major cooperative leadership in political circles are very few of them are small farmers, if any at all. As far as the physical conditions, yes, the physical conditions vary a great deal, and that's one of the reasons why you have a continuous movement between the rural and the urban. Because in some senses, the actual living conditions of workers from the villages in the marginal worker transformation who try to find jobs in the city, they will live in conditions in the city which are much worse than what they have in the village. Our survey shows that any of the amenities, certainly your television sets and other things, are not available to them in the city. They live in crowded sheds, sometimes 7 to 8 to a smallish kind of a shed. So the conditions are certainly not very attractive, but they get a much higher nominal wage. If you want an economist explanation, the fact is that the nominal wages are high, but the prices are also high. So if they can live in conditions with very low expenditure in urban centers and take the higher nominal wages back to the village, they get much greater weightage in village hierarchies. In economic sense, they're not always allowed to exercise that weightage. For instance, in Bihar, the dominant, the once backward but now dominant Yadavs stop the other castes from buying land. So you'll find this pattern where on the original small plot of land, they just keep building more and more stories going up because they're not allowed to buy more land with what they get. So you get patterns that emerge. But what that does is it takes the temporariness of short-term migration and makes it permanent. That the process is permanent, though the migration is short-term and the uncertainty remains. Right? But they have been stuck into that for long periods of time.
Wonderful. The second question is from Professor Ben Baer, who actually is the director of our South Asian Studies program. And I can just read it off. He says he's interested in the qualitative and experiential aspects of your study, in particular, the language and terms in which the poorest express their understanding of social inequality. And so he says, you spoke of this in terms of victimhood, but are there other ways in which a conceptualization of inequality is expressed? He realizes that suicide is also a statement of this effect. So so let's maybe address that, and then there's a few more questions that I'll try to club together.
Yes, the victimhood element here, if I may just spend a minute more on victimhood itself, it has an element of emancipation and the element of dominance. We use different measures for that. And the poorest, if you'll actually find, if we did an index of emancipation, that remains low across all the transformation. The sense of being victimhood among the poorest is actually quite low. You don't find the kind of agitated response that we used to get back in the 70s and 80s. There's a certain acceptance of it. What you find instead is a willingness to find a role, even a sort of minor role within large dominant groups, whether it's based on religion, whether it's based on a dominant caste. It takes those forms. So the class form has become less pronounced, particularly with some of the former backward castes getting relatively more assertive, gaining some amount of economic clout through either migration or any other element. So the language there is typically one of unfairness, but that unfairness language is used across the board, even by the dominant caste. So the value of that becomes that much less. But the language certainly is that of unfairness, but the expression of victimhood or of then occurs primarily, I would think, in terms of their actions. like whether it is in terms of suicides is an extreme one, but you could also have situations like the migrant crisis in India, where millions of workers got stuck on the streets without and had to walk, literally walk 1,000 kilometers and more to get home. So I mean, there are many expressions of inequality and discrimination. And yes, that is worth further exploration, but this is as far as we have got so far.
Great, thank you. A couple other questions. This is from Professor Vinay Sitapati, who's a visiting faculty member from Ashoka University, currently at Princeton. And he's asking, in your opinion, which is a better solution to rural inequality? Is it to build large sugarcane farms like parts of Maharashtra, or dispersed manufacturing like Tamil Nadu?
Well, our measures of inequality would all show that dispersed manufacturing pattern is much more. Our index of dominance there is less than the Maharashtra case, which is your entering agriculture transformation. The element, of course, is that the traditional elite does not lose out. So it doesn't get replaced. So what you get, the transformation from above, but the next generation is more educated and can tap the industrial options. So if you could generate a more widespread industrial pattern alongside processes with greater access being provided to the poor, that would be much more equal. But we don't see that anywhere in India as of now.
Yeah. Great. I mean, thank you for answering several of these questions. If I may, I'm just keeping an eye on the time as well. I think we have a few more minutes, so I'm going to ask a couple other questions. Maybe I'll read them all off so you can see there may be connections between them. So one of them, and you can see them in the chat as well, Dr. Pani, they're also in the chat. So one of them is asking more specifically an explanation of why suicide rates in Kerala is so high, even though other socioeconomic indicators like health and education are very good in Kerala. So that's one. The second one is asking what you think might happen in the future. This is from Patrick Apte, who's I don't know if you're still in India, Patrick, but he's a doctoral student in economics. And he's asking how does Dr. Pani think inequality will evolve as India becomes richer? And then a similar idea is around what do you think would happen with respect to inequality if we start thinking about natural farming, like zero budget natural farming programs being piloted in Andhra Pradesh. This is trying to get at zero carbon transition, some of these, rural strategies for reducing emissions. Why don't we take those three together, because some of them are, futuristic and others are looking at explanations for the suicide rates in Kerala.
The Kerala answer really demands a separate answer, because our understanding of Kerala is in many senses, can use a harsh word, schizophrenic. There is an element of Kerala that has certain indices, certain macro indices, which have been based around education and health, which have over time had a positive effect. But the process has been one in which the discrimination as opposed to tangible difference has remained, right? And has been very, very severe. It's a state in which there is widespread domestic violence, right? It's also a state in which patriarchal systems are quite deeply entrenched. So that when you have a process where you have to get your daughter out of agriculture, that process is done through a patriarchal system. You build a house which sort of misstates your actual economic status, and when you do that, you put yourself under a tremendous amount of of pressure. So you are in a situation where if you're trying to understand Kerala, I think it's important to make a distinction between long-term trends and the uncertainty and precariousness of everyday life across all inequalities, including gender inequalities or even economic inequalities. The difference between the tribal workers and the organized workers is very substantial. So it's a more complex picture than I think most pictures of Kerala tend to provide. As far as the future goes, what we are seeing in India now is a process of deeply entrenched identity politics. And that politics involves largely a movement out of agriculture. And that takes us really to a third question, that you would get an agriculture that emerges, which can be less labor intensive. But such a process would mean finding opportunities elsewhere. So what I'm saying is that even a more productive agriculture, a zero budget based sort of natural farming technology, even that does not necessarily have an impact, a more widespread impact on on the rural population. It can be concentrated, and much of its success would depend upon how much of the rural population is moved out of agriculture itself. That's a very short kind.
So relatedly, what are your thoughts as India gets richer? I mean, of course, the getting richer is itself unequal, but as in aggregate, as India gets more wealthy or richer, and then the related question is around urban migration from Nicholas, and he's asking, can you comment on how migration processes shape one's sense of inequality? Which social groups become most relevant for migrants when they assess their level of inequality? And I may add one other question from Narendar Pani, which is speaking about distal measures. So we talked about local measures, and I think Narendar, he's a postdoc in my group, is coming at it from an urban-rural migration perspective.
Right. You see, the urban-rural migration process does not follow in the leaving rural permanent transformation kind of transformation. It follows the pattern of traditional development theory, but everywhere else it does not. So find here is that if particularly when you have short-term migration, you come to the city and you can't afford the city because the cities are being built in very expensive styles, largely to attract foreign investment, and become quite unviable for most migrants. And you get the short-term migrants who live in the construction site and then go back to their villages. So that process has got, as I'm saying, has got stabilized. And over time, it might continue. So expect, in fact, if you look at the pattern of movement out of agriculture and movement out of rural areas, the movement out of agriculture is very rapid, but the movement out of rural areas is much more, much less, you see, in terms of proportion. So which is why India, even now in the last census, which was way back in 2011, had 68% of its population in rural areas. Right? So which is much more than what you find in any of the other developing nations. And that might well continue because the process of trying to make do with cheaper lifestyle in the village and a more higher nominal income in the city is getting a kind of permanence to it. Right? Certain existence, it's got health consequences, it's got consequences even for suicide. I think our suicide rates are increasing. So you have a number of issues that emerge, but that still seems to be the process that's becoming permanent.
And to the question about which social groups, I think that was from Nicholas.
Right. What has happened now is that originally you had a fairly strict hierarchy of castes. That has been largely eroded. Right. So eroded for a variety of reasons, including the movement or including migration. If I'm able to, in the first round of migration, the more prominent castes or more dominant castes were not willing to come to urban centers and work in these conditions. So the lower castes came in first. And when they got back, they could convert their higher nominal incomes into something more effective in the city, in the village. And with the democratization of panchayat institutions, they are very often been able to exercise a great deal of clout. There's a recent case of a taxi driver going back to a village in Bihar and mobilizing other taxi drivers. So he generated a large amount of resources, and he's now the president of the village panchayat. So that process changes caste hierarchies, but it increases the caste identity and the caste conflict. So in a way, the conflict moves from a vertical conflict based on hierarchy to a horizontal conflict based on caste identity. So many of the backward castes end up in very strong and very assertive positions.
Oh, sorry, I was muted. So on that note, it's 1 minute to go, and I think we actually have covered a lot of the questions. There was a question here on methods, but I just wanted to.
If I could, yeah, we have looked primarily, of course, we have made a number of methodological innovations in trying to capture, because you're basically, once you shift from the idea of averages to covering range, then a number of processes you require a variety of methods. We have used large data, we have used the primary surveys, and we have used ethnographies to kind of get a picture. But the thumb rule has always been that that we don't allow the best to become the enemy of the good. So we keep a kind of best kind of criteria for data and then say that, okay, that's not there, therefore we'll say nothing. We take the best, make the best of what is available and try it. And that's the way the whole exercise. Okay.
So do you want to say a few words about your book before we close?
Thank you very much. This book is called The Dynamics of Difference. It is about the transformations, the inequalities in the rural transformation. It covers the roughly similar territory to what I've tried to cover today. It tries to make, I think those of who are interested in the method that is used, it elaborates that in much greater detail. It also provides much more detailed results, and it is a much larger exercise in a way, but it is an effort to try and understand what is happening in rural India on the basis of whatever information is there. The starting point of it, if I may end with that, is that in the 1950s, with much less information or data than we have today, we had some of the most innovative economics and social theories coming out of India. And I think much of the reason why that has tended to decline with more information is because your dependence, the method has become much more focused on being the best at the cost very often of making the best use of what, or just being at the cost of the good in many cases.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. This was really inspiring and provided a different methodological perspective, but also a deep and rich perspective of how transitions and transformations are impacting people in rural India and how they're responding to it. So thank you on behalf of the center and all of those in attendance. I'm sure you'll be getting many emails and I'll be in touch. It's really, really interesting and important topic. Thank you again.
Thank you very much for having me. It was my